Today we have the pleasure of talking with Leesa Fields, who has an incredible background in international affairs. Before becoming a mother of two very different and remarkable children, she traveled and worked all over the world as a specialist in academic exchange programs, providing grants to global institutions. She then became an expert on higher functioning autism, as she was her son's principal advocate when he was unexpectedly diagnosed with what was then known as Asperger syndrome when he was still in preschool. She guided her daughter through a bilingual experience for her 12 years before college, and you're going to hear how Leesa and her husband, both of them graduates of the 4 top schools in the country, we're talking Standford, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, and admit that having those names on their CVs have served both of them very well. But in any case, they believe whatever higher education is suitable for each person. And in fact, community colleges are usually wholly undervalued. And actually, one of them gave their son a phenomenal education. Leesa and her husband model exploration for their 2 children, not only placing high importance on languages, taking them all over the world to learn about people and places so that they know them experientially, and all the while they've been navigating the specific needs of both of their children in and out of the classroom. Raising and schooling a son with Asperger's was not easy 30 years ago and still isn't easy. But you'll hear ways Leesa found to be proactive in an absolutely positive way so that the teachers and administrators wanted to work with her. She's going to share ways with us that she used the resources available in her city and county for her special needs son, and how all of her dedication helped him become a proactive and independent adult, now living on his own, when that's not often the case, even with high-functioning autistic children in their adult years. I think you're going to be amazed by the amount of information you'll hear and can use in your own circumstances if you have children who are autistic or students who are autistic. And the choices Leesa made about bilingualism and faith-based learning for her daughter. So you've probably already realized that Leesa's my sister, and you can hear more fascinating conversations at Doodles with Donna and free activities for special needs children and bilingual students at scaffoldingmagic.com. So let's start in with Leesa Fields as we're clarifying what the interest may be in sharing her experiences. Leesa, welcome. So, tell me about your experience, your own educational experience first, and then we're going to speak about your 2 children, okay? You started in a public school. Do you believe in the public school system in the United States?
I believe that every child should have the proper education that's beneficial to their needs, whether it's public or private. We have 2 children, and one went to private school and one went to public school because that was what each of them needed and what was the proper education for each of them. That said, I couldn't make a sweeping generalization about believing in public school in the United States because it's so varied. We've been very fortunate, us growing up and my children growing up, to live in states and counties that had excellent public education systems. Over the course of my work over the last 13 years, I've seen places where the public education system is really failing children. So I can't say that I'm a fan of public school all across the country, but I'm a huge fan of the public school systems that I have had direct contact with for me or for my children.
Okay, but we could also say that, for instance, our parents deliberately chose what we were going to grow up based on the educational system, which is something that you and your husband did as well. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so how big a factor was the public school system when you were looking for your house where you are now?
Big.
Okay, and so let's go into the difference between your son, who has special needs, and your daughter, who went to a private school and was a bilingual school. And
Yes.
Why did you feel it was necessary for her to be in private school, and why did you feel it was necessary for your son to be in public school? Let's start with your son first.
Yeah, we'll start with Jeremy because he's older. When Jeremy was 3 years old, he was identified as being on the autism spectrum. In those days, it was called Asperger syndrome, and these days it's high-functioning autism or somewhere on the autism spectrum. Private schools in this area had the capability of handling children with severe special needs. um, Down syndrome, children with cognitive disabilities, sometimes children with learning disabilities. You remember, this is 30 some odd years ago. And they had some capability. I said public schools, right? Yes, they had some capability for dealing with other issues. Private schools, not so much. Private schools tended to stay in their own lanes and do a little bit of learning disabilities, but not really be very good with any kind of other issues. That said, when Jeremy was identified as having Asperger's, we looked at both public and private schools. He was in a faith-based preschool, which was fine for the first couple of years he was there. But once he was identified, we realized he needed more services. And the county we live in had those services in public school. So starting when he was 4 years old, he was in the public system. There was no specific program for children with Asperger's or children on the autism spectrum at that time. But I spent a lot of time, with a little bit of help, researching what schools there were around that had early childhood education programs that would fit his needs, and we found one. Let me backtrack then for Jessica. For us, it had always been important that she be in a religious school. The religious part was important to us because we wanted her to have a dual track education and not have to go to supplementary school after school. We wanted it to be just part of her normal education and be very mainstream, and her not to have to think it was very different that she was going to school after school or on the weekend. And the bilingualism was a huge part of it too, because we were all raised knowing, you and I were raised, and my husband was raised knowing that a second language was very important in this world. So that's why we put her in private school, and she was in private school starting in preschool all the way until she graduated from high school.
It's all really interesting and really important. So let's go back to Jeremy for a minute. You decided he would be better in public school, but you refer to his earliest education as faith-based. Can you explain that?
Jeremy was in a preschool run by our synagogue. That's the faith-based school.
Okay, so he was in private school until he was 4 years old, right?
Yes, because there are no public preschools in this country.
Ah, okay. You might know that in Spain, preschool is public, 3 to 5 years old.
There is only mandated education starting in kindergarten in this country, unless you qualify for Head Start.
And Head Start is for lower income families, right?
Yeah, so the only preschools are private in this country.
All right, so you have the resources to have had him diagnosed at a very young age that he was autistic, which, as you say, more than 30 years ago, is still unusual. And I want to go back, but what would you say to parents who see that their children might be a little different, but have not done any concentrated diagnoses until their children were maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, and even older? Is there still a possibility of helping them very concretely?
There is. I'm not a professional educator. There is, and it's better to identify it before at any age, but it's best to diagnose it early. And at least here, there are public resources also that you can tap into that will help diagnose a child and help them get into the proper program. So we pursued it privately with the psychologist that we were using, and we also pursued it through the county. Our county has something called Child Find, and Jeremy was tested through their auspices as well in order to qualify for public county programs.
So what were some of the elements that kind of triggered you, that cued you into that Jeremy was a little bit different?
His development was uneven. In certain ways, he was way ahead of the curve for his age, and in certain ways, he was behind. So his speech was delayed, but he was way ahead cognitively. And so he was doing jigsaw puzzles for 5 and 6 year olds when he was 2. He taught himself to read before he turned 5, but that was after he'd already been diagnosed. But it was just uneven. We were in a play group with probably, 8 or 9 other kids exactly his age. And as I was watching them develop, Jeremy's development was very different from theirs. And then once Jess came along and she was developing on a normal curve, it was more obvious to us and to our pediatrician as well.
What is the age difference between the two of them?
2 years.
Okay. So what are some of the services that Jeremy received once you put him into a special program?
He had OT, he had speech therapy, he had some PT, but he was also in a full day preschool from the time he was 4, when he was 4 and when he was 5, that was supposed to be dealing with kids with emotional disabilities, but for Jeremy, it was dealing with his uneven development issues. And it was a small class with 2 teachers who were so hands-on that after the first year they had him, they realized that he was about to pop and start reading, like crazy reading. They went out with their own money and bought books for him. So when he started the next school year, there were books for him. And he'd already surpassed those books by the time he came back to school. But it was a very individualized education. And once you start in the private school, in the special needs system in the United States, you have something called an individualized education program, or you have I think it's a 504 or 405 plan, but we had an IEP that sets out individualized education program that sets out all the services they are supposed to receive and all of the benchmarks they need to hit in order to move on to the next level. So Jeremy had an IEP, and he would hit all of those benchmarks with all the help he was getting. So by the time he was done with the 2 years in the early childhood program, he was ready to go on to a special needs kindergarten, and that would be the next step.
Okay, so this next question is more for teachers than parents, because a lot of teachers really know so little about autism, and yet they have a lot of students who are autistic. And I think it's fascinating and almost ironic that he was placed into a program that was for emotional needs. So the question here that most teachers have is, autistic children have difficulty showing emotions, but they have emotions. Is that right?
Yes. Kids on the autism spectrum, it's a spectrum for a reason, because they manifest in so many different ways. Some of them do act out. Some of them do have emotional issues and behavioral issues. Jeremy did not. When he started in these programs, that was all there was. There really wasn't anything else that we could tap into that was going to work for him. These days, there are so many more programs, at least here. There are preschool programs, early childhood programs for children on the autism spectrum that are being handled in much different ways. I spent a lot of time researching what programs there were at the various different levels he was at, because it was important that we find the right fit. And it was really on my shoulders to do that. For teachers, I think it's just so important to recognize that every child has their own needs and work to help with those needs, regardless of the label. I don't believe in labels being the most important thing in the world. And people have asked me all the time, what do you do about a label? I don't care what the label is. You deal with the issues, you deal with the symptoms. So if Jeremy needed OT, we got him OT. If he needed PT, he got PT. If he needed speech, we got him speech. And I would say 99% of that was through our county, because by the time he was in the county system, they provided it. But I had to fight for some of it a lot.
Okay, and I know on my side of it, I didn't see a lot of it because I was living in a different state, but it really did affect me. I was becoming a teacher when you were researching what would be best for Jeremy. And one thing I know, and one thing you were incredibly on top of, was practicing the lessons that he was learning in school at home. So for instance, the emotional part, some students act out. Jeremy, would it be correct to say his responses to different situations are always appropriate, and you needed to help him, and you still need to help him be appropriate for his responses?
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm not sure I can give you a lot of specifics, but we've spent a lot of time. He's 36 now. And for a long time, when he was still living with us, I would spend a chunk of each summer working on different life skills with him, or different ways of handling things, so that he learns best by repetition. And so that it becomes routinized. And that's all worked. A minor little example is Jeremy was very rigid in terms of what he used to eat. He had the same thing for breakfast and dinner every day, and something else for lunch every day, and there was no deviation. And finally, when he was about 19 or 20, I said, okay, it's time to start trying new foods. And so we decided that summer he would try 2 different foods. And he did. And he was fine with that. He said it was okay, and he tried them, and we worked out which 2 he was going to try. And if he didn't like them, we went to 2 different ones. But by the end of the summer, he was eating 2 different foods. And that has become part of his diet. And at this point, his diet is much more varied because we continued that. But that's just a small example of how we had to do things.
Well, also, food is not just about taste for someone like Jeremy. It's the texture, it's the aspect of it, right? Can you give us a couple of examples of things that you've been practicing with him for these 36 years, or a little less than 36, but all these years? If we're living in a Western civilization, there are some things that are considered polite, and there's some considered not polite. And you have had to kind of hammer home these saying thank you, for instance, or can you give us a couple of examples of responses that you've had to enforce over and over again?
One of the very first things that we had to teach him and that he had to learn was to look people in the eye when he spoke with them. That was a big one.
Do the specialists tell you why an autistic child may not want to look someone in the eye?
I think it's too much stimulation, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, that's really important. Is there anything else that you would like to tell parents who might have autistic children on any sort of spectrum about different services that you would recommend they look for?
The most important thing is to really work as a partner with whatever service providers you are pursuing. So if you try and be adversarial, you're not going to get anywhere, or you're going to get somewhere very, very slowly. But if you think there's something going on with your child that is not on the normal progression or the normal development stage, pursue it first with your pediatrician, because they often have big resources, and then pursue it with the school system. But as I said, in a constructive way. So every school year, I convened a meeting with all of Jeremy's teachers, as well as the special needs coordinator for the school, or the resource person at the school he was at, and sat down and prefaced the meeting by saying, I look at this as a team effort to make Jeremy as successful as possible. How can we do that this year? And I would also sit down and say, you might see this, this, and this from him. You might see that he, I don't know, for a while he had a tick where he would rub his nose. You might see that. For a while I'm trying to think of what else he had certain things he would do. Or you might see that he has a book that he's always got open, and you may just need to take it away from him, have him sit in the front row, that kind of thing. And we would always come up with a plan. And I always gave them my phone number or my email address so that they could call me if there was ever an issue. And we never had a problem because everyone was so responsive and so receptive to that. I do remember sitting in an IEP meeting at one point, though, and crying because one of the county was not interested in giving Jeremy, I can't remember what service it was. It probably was speech therapy. And I finally said, I started crying and I said, he needs this. He really, really needs this. And I felt terrible for crying later, but the people who were on my side were saying, that got him the speech therapy because you were so passionate about it and you really felt so that it was so important. So the biggest thing is to be your child's advocate. You've got to be your child's advocate, but in a positive way.
Okay, so attacking the teachers, the administrators is not the way to go, you're saying?
Not a way to go, no. That
okay,
will not
in any
help.
situation, pretty much any situation, I think we could probably follow that rule, right?
I think that's true. But I think in this case, you've got children who they need so much help. And the earlier and the more help you get them, the better they're going to succeed. So, I mean, by the time Jeremy was in high school, he was fully mainstreamed.
That was my next question. What age was he when you finally decided it was appropriate to send him into a mainstream classroom? And what was the transition like?
So even in elementary school, starting in first grade, he had a certain amount of mainstreaming, but he would go with an aide. When he was in second through fifth grade, he was also in an ED, an emotional disability class. But I chose it because the teacher was so unbelievable that I knew that she would do everything in her power to make Jeremy's time with her a success. And part of the program at that school was that the kids with special needs would be mainstreamed into mainstream classes, for an hour a day, 2 hours a day, or for certain subjects, and they would go with an aide. So if there was ever a need to pull the child out, the child could be pulled out. So Jeremy always had a mainstream component of his education. By the time he got to middle school, which in his time was 6th through 9th grade, he was fully mainstreamed with an aide. So he was in all honors classes because fortunately for Jeremy, he's very bright and that was one of his saving graces. But he always had someone who was in the classroom with him. And in middle school, that was really important because that's when all the kids start bullying and teasing. And we almost pulled him out for a while. And then in high school, he was 100% mainstreamed. He did not go to classes with an aide, but he had a resource teacher he could touch base with at any time during the day that he wanted to. And the teachers knew he had a resource teacher, so they could touch base with her as well.
Okay, so that there is thinking that pulling a student out is not beneficial. And you're adamant, it sounds like, that there are certain times when it really did benefit Jeremy. Is that right?
I don't think you can generalize. I think it really is important to remember what each child is capable of. I would not have been a fan of fully mainstreaming him in elementary school. He got exactly what he needed. And the reason that he was mainstreamed for the most part in elementary school was that he was really bright. He is really bright. And he needed the academic stimulation of being in a mainstream class where he could be with other children who were at his level or higher and learn in a really normal situation.
Okay, and can we touch really briefly on the bullying, because it affected Jeremy pretty deeply, can we say?
In middle school, yeah. Middle school was bad. I'm not sure middle school is good for any child. It was bad because in middle school, no one wants to be different. And if you're different, you're going to be bullied, you're going to be teased. When you get to high school, it's okay to be different. And his classmates loved him because he was the one who would raise his hand and ask the obvious question, or basically tell the teacher that the teacher didn't know what they were talking about, which was what all the kids were thinking about, but were afraid to say. So in middle school, it's not okay to be different. And we looked long and hard after, I guess, when he was in 7th grade, right in the middle of middle school, at whether we should pull him out and put him in a private school or whether we should homeschool him. And ultimately, we decided to leave him where he was, but we really kept our eyes on what was going on as carefully as we could. And the resource teachers were trying as hard as they could to be on top of it.
All right. And what I'm also hearing, and what I think I also remember, at least vaguely, is that it's very important to be transparent. It's important to be transparent with the person that's with him. It's important to be transparent with the teachers. I know from my perspective as a teacher, if a parent will explain something to me about their child, it brings down a lot of my anxiety because I may not exactly know what that student is responding to. And if I know that it has nothing to do really with what I've been planning and the learning environment I've created, and it has to do with that student in particular in pretty much any setting, then having the parent offer that information is extremely helpful.
Every year, and check in other times if necessary. That was why I convened those meetings. I mean, I thought that was so important. And I usually waited until about a week or two into school because I knew the resource teacher would be giving some kind of intro, but I waited until a week or two into school, but by the time they'd kind of gotten to know who Jeremy was, to have those meetings. But the example of him blurting things out, I mean, I just said to them, you're going to hear, you may not want to hear what you're going to hear, but you're going to hear the unvarnished truth from Jeremy, how he's feeling. He has unfiltered feelings and you're going to hear it. And there's not a lot we can do about that.
I mean, we really are, I'm trying to focus on education, but Jeremy transitioning into his professional life, this has transitioned with him because you have set him up with a roommate that he's been with for how long?
7 years.
7 years. And you and the parents are in constant communication about this sort of thing? For
a while, we would get together periodically for dinners, but basically the guys are in their 30s. They need to learn how to coexist by themselves. We talk to Jeremy sometimes if he thinks he's having an issue with Sam. I imagine Sam talks to his parents, but we basically let them coexist as peacefully as they can. We have not stepped in to do anything to change their relationship. We've offered Jeremy suggestions on how to be a better roommate or how to put up with some of Sam's idiosyncrasies. And I hope and think that probably Sam's parents have done the same.
And Sam has some of the same issues as Jeremy?
Yes.
Okay. So it works out for the time. Sometimes Jeremy will be fairly blunt as he's so good about being, right?
And so is Sam.
Yeah.
So is Sam.
Sure. Okay. So we're going to come back to Jeremy, but let's touch on Jessica now. All right. You decided that it was very important for Jess to have a religious education and a bilingual education. And how difficult was that, or how challenging was that to find for her?
Oh, that was easy because we have an excellent Jewish day school in this community. And I mean, we knew from the very beginning that's where we wanted to send her. Once I visited it for the first time and once John visited it for the first time, we were 100% there. Their general education was excellent, or we wouldn't have put her there. And then the religious side was also excellent. And it was a nice balance. And we just loved the feel of the school and the way everything was put together. And it was not difficult at all.
All right. And what was the percentage of learning in English and learning in this case, Hebrew?
60-40.
English 60 and Hebrew 40?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to touch on something that you may not know, but in Spain, there are some languages that are very specific to the region and are not spoken anywhere else in the world. And yet the educational system in those provinces are adamant that that those children need to learn them. Hebrew is not necessarily a language that is not spoken. It's spoken in a lot of different countries. Why did you decide that learning Hebrew from kindergarten to 8th grade, was it?
12th.
Kindergarten to 12th grade was something that was going to be beneficial for Jess?
Well, the Hebrew comes along with the Jewish studies as well. It was a package. Um, Starting in sixth grade, they could also take Spanish or French.
Did
And she
she?
did. She took Spanish. She took Spanish. Yeah, from sixth or seventh grade until high school, she took until 12th grade. She took Spanish. It's called General Studies and Judaic Studies. So it's not English and Hebrew. It's General Studies and Judaic Studies. So the Hebrew part comes along with all of the biblical stuff and the religious stuff. So she needed that. She needed to learn how to read and write in Hebrew. She needed to learn how to speak Hebrew in order to access the text and the religious information.
Most people will probably accept the idea that when you're learning in a different language, it literally does, expands the tracks in your mind. Does Jess have any special needs?
She does. She has ADD. She also she has anxiety issues. The ADD was treated, it was identified when she was in probably elementary school, later on in elementary school. And she takes medication for that.
Was it a difficult decision for you to let her take medicine for the ADD and for the stress?
No. And Jeremy also had ADHD, and he was on medication for ADHD. The way we look at it and the way people around us encouraged us to look at it was, if your child had a medical issue, you would medicate it. So if they have another kind of issue, you also want to help them deal with it. You want to make it as easy for them as possible. I mean, to have a child with ADD and not give them the resources to deal with it. I mean, she also had therapy, and Jeremy had therapy as well. But in order to really deal with those issues, to help them focus, we felt it was important to use medication.
Okay, now, so let's go back to the bilingual issue. Now, you and I grew up in an atmosphere of proactivity when it comes to languages. Our parents believed that learning languages was very important, that travel was very important. We grew up in a general atmosphere where there was a lot of critical thinking, even in social situations. You're married to Jonathan, who grew up speaking Hebrew and English, and so bilingualism was also very important to him. What would you say to parents who are considering bilingual education but are not convinced? They might think that the bilingual you're learning, in your case, in Jess's case, 60% and 40%, that it might be detrimental to the English side of her learning?
I don't see any downside. I think it's a gift. I think starting a second language as early as possible is a huge gift. It doesn't matter what the language is, because it does expand your brain. It does expand your learning horizons, and you can always pick up other languages more easily as you get older. And it just also gives you a different perspective on the world, because you're learning a different language and presumably a different culture while you're learning that language. I think it's a huge deal. And in the United States, we don't do it enough.
What about Jeremy? Did he have a bar mitzvah?
He did.
And did he learn Hebrew for his bar mitzvah?
Kind of. He had a private tutor. He never went to Hebrew school. He had a private tutor from when he was like in first or second grade, and she did the best she could with him, and he did the best he could for his bar mitzvah, and then he basically had no more interest in Hebrew. But he did take Latin in high school.
Now, Jeremy loves to write fantasy books or science fiction. What would he call it?
Fantasy.
Latin comes up a lot in science fiction. Do you think that was one of the reasons why he was proactive about taking Latin?
No, he had to take a language.
Okay, so he had to take something.
Yeah.
What would you say to parents who have special needs children about learning another language?
Again, that's an individual question. If the child is capable of it and it's not going to impact getting all the other services they need and the education that's going to help them grow as a human being, go for it. If it's really going to be a problem, then it's not as important. That's a huge deal. There are many special needs kids in this country who speak two languages because they come from families where English is not the first language. And so English is their second language, and they deal with it. You know, that was not the case here. It would have been great if Jeremy had learned a second language, but he didn't.
All right. So how do you think that Jess's education, learning in a bilingual school from kindergarten to 12th grade, how do you think that affected her adult life? She's how old now?
She's 34.
She's 34. So she went to Israel.
She went to Israel in high school, and she also went to Israel after she graduated college. She loves Israel. I mean, going to a Jewish day school, really, some kids come out of there being very religious. Some of them come out rejecting everything they've learned. Some come out with a huge love of Israel, which was Jessica. She has a huge love of Israel. And so that the bilingual education clearly had an impact on her that way. She won't set foot in a synagogue, but she will go to Israel anytime you ask her to.
All right. And how do you think that it's affected her, considering differences in other people in her social environment? I know these are kind of interesting questions, but you may know the answer to them without even realizing it.
Well, I was going to say she married a guy from Denmark. You know, I don't know if she had not had either the bilingual education or all the travel that we took them on, the exposure to other countries. I'm not sure she would have married someone from a different country if she hadn't had both of those things.
All right, so let's talk about all the travel, because you believe even more strongly than our parents, or you sort of acted even more strongly than our parents about travel. Can you tell us about taking your kids on trips and the fact that even as adults, they still went on trips with you? It's only been very recently that Jess has said, yeah, maybe not, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you just tell us?
Yeah, I mean, John, as you know, I was raised in a family where we traveled a lot. John was raised in a family where he traveled even more. And we always traveled around the United States, partly because my in-laws lived on the West Coast. So just to get there, we had to fly. And our parents lived in Florida. We had to fly there. But we took vacations all over the US. And they were 3 and 5. Both sets of grandparents were spending the summer in Europe. So we thought that would be a great time to take the kids on their first trip to Europe. And we did. We took a 3.5-year-old and a 5.5-year-old to France and to England. And those were very different trips from any of the trips that we had taken when we were growing up, because we spent a lot of times on carousels and riding ponies and going to playgrounds and going to markets where we could see, birds and animals. But it was a great first trip for them and they loved it. And since then, we've traveled overseas with them a lot. These two kids are really, really well traveled. And they've both appreciated it. They've both told us how much they appreciated it. And the fact that Jess continues to travel with her husband overseas, not just to see his family in Denmark, just basically ratifies we did something that really was important to them. And Jeremy will go anywhere we take him. We're taking him to Denmark next week, and he's always up for a new adventure.
So we were raised to believe that travel was important. Why do you think, though, that you are still convinced? Why is travel so important for anyone, and especially for families?
It's the only way to get a view of how people live differently. You can't have a good worldview unless you see it and experience it yourself, if you're able to. You can learn about things, but until you see them and touch them and feel them and smell them and experience them, it's very different. And we've been very fortunate that we've had the resources to be able to do that. I still do that when I work and travel around the United States. I find things in the United States that I never would have thought of had I not been to those places. And I have a much different and better appreciation for this country, having been to so many states that I'd never been to before and met people in those states. It's really important to just kind of see how other people live and realize that the way you live is not the only way.
Well, the other thing here that we have to bring up is about the national parks, because one reason that you've seen so much of the States is because your husband is passionate about seeing every national park in the United States. Is that correct? And how many has he visited now?
He has visited 62 out of 63.
And have you gone to those 62 as well?
I've been to 52.
Okay. And what is the last one?
The last one is American Samoa, and it's still partially closed because of COVID. So we're holding off a little while on that one.
Okay, so you have brought your children as well on a lot of those national park visits, correct?
Mostly Jeremy, but yes.
Okay. Do you think that it affects them when they have more of an authentic view of the importance of national parks when they hear it in the news? Would that be a correct statement?
Well, I think anytime you've been somewhere and you hear about it in the news, it personalizes it for you. So yeah. I mean, when I read the news and I see something about a place that I've been or a place that I know someone from, I read that article over some other article because it speaks to me. And so, yes, I think the kids definitely appreciated having been to those places in this country, the national parks, as well as different parts of this country and overseas. It changes you.
I'm going to ask you some questions again about Jeremy's education. You were very privileged. You've had an incredible professional career, and you've taken up again after your children have left school. But when Jeremy was in the process of finding his way through the whole special needs environment, you were very privileged in that you had the time to research, to speak to teachers. You weren't working outside of the house. And so you had the time to do it. And so you know pretty intimately, even though it was a long time ago, you know pretty intimately how to navigate the system. What is one of the most important things you would tell parents who are beginning that process, who are in that process, aside from being positive?
I mean, you're right. I was very fortunate. We made a conscious decision that I would stay home. We knew one of us needed to be home, and I was very lucky that I could be home. I mean, I think the stay positive, yes, being the advocate for your child is the most important thing. It's just to be totally on top of what's going on and not be afraid to speak up if something is not working, and ask for help wherever you can. I still talk to parents of kids on the autism spectrum. I talked to one last week to kind of share ideas, because even if you think you've covered all bases, someone else might be able to give you a different idea or a different suggestion about how to deal with an issue. Montgomery County had a special needs section of the PTA that I was very active in. I was the special needs representative at his elementary school for a while to educate the mainstream parents as well as the special ed parents as to what kind of services were available. It's a tough one because you're dealing with the emotional part of having a child who's not developing on the normal trajectory and trying to find that child the best services you can find to help them. So it's a hard question to answer.
I would say as a teacher also, it's probably very important to assume the teacher is doing the best he or she can, and to assume that they might have said something or done something out of ignorance and not something out of intention. And I say that from the teacher's perspective, because one of the most difficult parts of teaching is not the students and not the administration, but parents who are angry. And I understand that they get angry because they don't know what's going on in the classroom. But I guess what I'm leading to is when you're saying, stay on top of things, keep communication open, I think it's also remembering to be respectful. And it sounds like that's what you always were really good about being, but it's something that you might want to repeat for other parents who are in the process, because it is very emotional when your child is not being treated the way you want her to be.
I think you're absolutely right. Teachers are doing the best they possibly can, and I have utmost respect for teachers. I could never be one. I could never stand in front of a group of kids and talk at them or teach them or try and involve them. I just couldn't do it. And I did have the utmost respect for every one of his teachers. And that's why I said we were always part of the team. And keeping the communication lines open was key. I was always available to them. And for the most part, they were always available to me. And we never had problems with a teacher.
Okay, so again, I think it goes back to you being respectful, and I think being educated also about what his needs were really helped the teachers, because I give workshops all the time for teachers who have such a wide range of special needs students and they don't know what to do. So if a parent comes in and gives advice, it helps everybody.
It's nice to come from the parents, but it also would help to come from the school system, unfortunately. And some school systems don't do that. And we were very fortunate that our school system does and continues to.
Okay, so I guess the last question here, unless there's something you're dying to tell me about the educational experiences of one of your or both of your children, is what would you have changed if you could have, or what was the best decision you made about both children? I like both questions. Let's go with both of them.
All right. Look, nothing's perfect, but both of our children got the education that was appropriate for them. And we were pleased with the education that each of them got in their K through 12 education, in their K through 12 programs, and in Jeremy's case, in the preschool as well. It stood them both well when they got to college. Neither one of them had any problems adjusting to college and doing the schoolwork there. So academically, no complaints, no, everything was fine. Everything was good. Everyone's education depends on what teacher they have. Are all teachers fabulous? No. But that has nothing to do whether it's a private school or a public school. It's a teacher or a student. So, were there a few teachers along the way that we would have liked to have changed for each one of them? Sure. But the big picture is that they both got excellent educations. And so there's nothing I really would have changed because we worked very hard to get them each what they needed.
Okay. And so can you think, let's just focus on Jeremy for a second. Is there one decision you made that you think was something you really had to decide yes or no, and you decided one way and it was the best decision you could have made?
The hardest decision was to put him into special ed. When we were told when he was 3 years old that he was going to need special services, we were devastated. We knew something was going on, but we didn't know what it was. And we thought, okay, we'll get him some help and he'll be fine. But when they came back to us, or when our psychologist came back to us and she said, this is what we think is going on and he really needs some serious help, that was a hard thing to hear. And when they told me what programs to start going to look at, and I would go look at them and I didn't see anybody who looked like Jeremy, it was very hard to make the jump to put him in a program where he was going to get what he needed. And ultimately he did. So that was a tough decision to say, let's pull the plug on where he was. And we'd intended to put him also in a Jewish day school, but that was not going to happen. So that was a very hard decision. But it was the right one.
So I don't think this applies to you, but some parents might have felt so much social stigma, the pressure of social stigma, that they don't put their children in a special needs program. What would you say to that?
We know people who didn't do it, and you do it for your child. You don't do it for yourself. We lost friends along the way, not because we chose to put him in special ed, not because of the stigma of putting him in special ed, but because they couldn't handle the fact that we were dealing with other issues. They were so set on, how their children were developing normally and, they were doing this and they were doing that, and they just couldn't handle Jeremy's differences. And we just stopped seeing them because it was too painful.
There was a time when I was tutoring a boy the same age as Jeremy. I think they were both around 19 or 20 at the time. And he had all of the same issues as Jeremy. And he did not know how to function really in the world his parents wanted him to function in. They were completely resistant to admitting that there was anything wrong. The boy had such a high stress level because he did not have the tools to know what to do in different situations. He knew he was different. He knew he wasn't reacting in a way that made people around him comfortable, and yet he had the tools. And I compared it to Jeremy, who does have those tools. It doesn't mean that Jeremy is comfortable in every situation, but at least he knows how to handle himself in most situations. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. And we know some people whose son was not identified as having special issues until he was in college, which to me means the parents totally missed something and the educators totally missed something, because someone should have caught that. And if maybe they did and brought it up to the parents and the parents denied it, but that kid now is Jeremy's age. His parents are paying for him to live in an apartment and he wants nothing to do with them. And I think he doesn't have a job. And I think he just basically sits in his apartment all day playing video games.
Let's talk about Jeremy. He's 36 years old. He's had a job for how many years?
He's had a job since he finished graduate school. So
how independent is he?
I would say he's 95% independent. He lives independently. He pays his own bills. He cooks and shops for himself. He has his own car. He drives himself places. He needs a little bit of help once in a while navigating things, but so does our 34-year-old daughter. So he's launched. He will never be 100% independent, I don't think, because he's very gullible and I'm always afraid of him being taken advantage of. But for the most part, he goes to the gym every day. He navigates life pretty independently.
Okay. And you would accredit that to all of the tools that he learned from the time he was 4 years old. Is that right?
Everything was a building block. Just like your scaffolding, everything was a building block. Everything was a building block. And Jeremy has two attributes that have always served him really, really well. One is his intelligence, because he picks things up fast because he's really bright. The other is his desire to please. And if he knows that he's doing something that's not making us happy, he's going to want to please us. Or if we set a task or a goal, he's going to want to reach that goal because he wants to please us. And that has helped enormously over the years. So that's been a huge help. I mean, every once in a while, he'll become an adolescent at age 36, but we can deal with that.
So do all of us, right? So do all of us.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what would you consider the best decision you made for Jess as she was going through her educational process?
Treating her like a different child than Jeremy. We always say we raised two only children, and not saying, oh, well, because he's doing this, she has to do that. Because she's doing that, he has to do this. Treating them both as individual people and working towards the needs that each of them had and filling those needs.
That's a wonderful place to end, Leesa. Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
You're welcome.
There is one other question I wanted to ask you, and that's about higher education. How do you feel about higher education? What is your sort of general attitude towards it?
Well, I think it's important, clearly. both of our kids went to college, and Jeremy has a graduate degree. Jessica has a higher education certificate in social media. So they've both pursued higher education, and both John and I have graduate degrees. So it kind of went along with the path. With Jeremy, we knew we wanted him to go to college, but we weren't sure what kind of format was going to take. And one of his counselors in high school suggested that we enroll him in a community college for 2 years so he could get his feet wet in a higher education environment, but not be overwhelmed by a university setting. And she actually even trained him on taking the bus to get to Montgomery College, which is the community college he ultimately went to. And he started taking classes there his senior year in high school, 1 day a week. They had special needs counselors, which was amazing. So he had a counselor up there who would help him choose his classes and which professor he would take based on how those professors handled special needs kids. So his 2 years there were not only amazing because it gave him a next transition, but he had a very, very positive educational experience there, complete with internships at the Library of Congress and various other places that he would never have had at a big university right off the bat. And all of his classes transferred over to the University of Maryland, and he received a full ride scholarship because of how well he did in community college.
Wow. Okay, because there's a huge divide in the country. Most people know how expensive university is in the United States, how expensive college is. And yet what you're saying is community college, which is who pays for community college and what is the percentage of it next to the University of Maryland, for instance?
So community college is much less expensive than a four-year university. And Jeremy also got a scholarship to attend community college, so we didn't have to pay for that either. It's run by the Montgomery County, so it's heavily subsidized. The credits are much less expensive, though, than at a university. It's a much more affordable option, and people can also go part-time. A lot of adults go back for continuing education programs, not trying to get a degree, but to go for classes. And so you've got people from 18 years old up to 60, 70, 80 years old taking classes.
Okay, so we could say that if you know specifically what you want to do at any age, and you go in there very consciously, that the education you get in a community college could be just as good, if not better, than going to an Ivy League school or the schools where you're going to be paying student loans for most of your adult life. Is that right?
I think that community colleges are highly underrated. They are so amazing. And you can go to community college for 2 years and then transfer to a four-year school, to any school. You can go to an Ivy, you can go to a state school, whatever you decide, and get that degree and pay half of the tuition because you've gone to community college for half the time. It's a much more affordable option, and it's often a very good transition for kids not ready to go off to a four-year school.
And what was Jess's experience?
Jessica went to a wonderful private university, University of Rochester. She fell in love with it the very second she set her foot on campus, and she got an excellent education there, and she loved it. She also had a scholarship based on academic achievement. Not full ride, but she got a scholarship.
All right, and then you went to Stanford. Jonathan went to, what was his undergrad? Harvard, and then his law degree was at
Yale.
So it couldn't have been that much better. Couldn't have been better, right? How do you then sort of balance in your mind the difference between the schooling that you and Jonathan got and the schooling that your children got?
They both got exactly what they needed and what was appropriate for them, and they got excellent educations. Many higher ed systems do have special needs programs, not just the community colleges. So Jeremy went to the University of Maryland, which is a state university, and they also had some support. He didn't need a lot of it, but it's there. And even private schools have that as well. It's just become so much more common. So many people are being identified as having special needs all across the board, not just autism spectrum disorders, but ADD, ADHD, any kind of special need is being identified. And so schools now have resources to help people navigate the system.
But what you're saying then is don't just look for the content, don't just look for the courses, but speak with the counselors at each school.
Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely.
Okay. And there are counselors, because I don't even think that I would have been very conscious of that. So it's really important for parents to know about.
Yeah, it's really important, and they are there. Some of them, there are some schools that specifically specialize in helping kids with different learning issues, different learning styles. But even at mainstream universities, they have special needs programs or special needs resource teachers to help you navigate, which I think anybody can use. Anybody can use that or need that. Yeah.
That's a wonderful place to end, Leesa. Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
You're welcome.
conversation for the time being with Leesa Fields. I hope you're now a bit more informed as to the choices you can confidently make with special needs children, the importance of being realistic when our children and students need special attention for the time they're in the classroom and for their future as adults, and what the benefits are of bilingual education. You can find other equally informative conversations at Doodles with Donna and free activities at scaffoldingmagic.com. In the meantime, have fun in your classes and home, and see you soon.